the horse was worth less than the girl.
Everyone at Hartfield Market knew it. A sway-backed gelding with a cracked hoof and a disposition that suggested it had long ago given up on the world. But when Lord Ashby led his daughter forward by the wrist, his fingers leaving white marks on her skin, and announced that she was part of the bargain, no one said a word. Not the farrier, not the blacksmith's wife, not the vicar standing 3 stalls away, pretending to examine turnips. The silence had a texture, thick, compliant, cowardly. And into that silence walked a man no one expected. Edward Hale, the Duke of Thornfield, had come to the market for a stallion. He had not come for a girl with bare feet and a dress that had been washed so many times it had forgotten its original color. He had not come for the way she stood, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes fixed on a point above the crowd as though she could will herself somewhere else. He had not come for any of this. But when Lord Ashby shook her wrist and said, "She cooks, she cleans, she doesn't talk back. What more could you want in a deal?" Something in the Duke's chest turned over like a key in a rusted lock. She reminded him of someone. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, the angle of her jaw, the way her collarbones stood sharp beneath her skin, the particular quantity of stillness that was not submission, but endurance. She reminded him of Catherine. Catherine, who had died in a fire at Briarwood Hall 6 years ago, while he stood on the lawn and watched the roof collapse and did nothing. Nothing. Because by the time he had understood what was happening, the flames had already won. How much? The words left his mouth before he could examine them. Lord Ashby's eyes went bright with avarice. For the horse? For everything. The transaction took 4 minutes. Lord Ashby accepted £12, 8 for the horse, 4 for his daughter, and walked away without looking back. The girl watched him go. Her expression did not change. Not a tremor, not a flinch, not the collapse of composure that Edward had braced himself for. She simply watched her father disappear into the crowd the way one watches weather change, with the resigned understanding that nothing about it was personal. "What is your name?" Edward asked. She turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of river stones, grey-green, flecked with something that might have been gold if the light were different. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat precision of someone who had learned that words, like bones, could be broken if handled carelessly. "Margaret." "Margaret what?" "Just Margaret. He sold the rest." The carriage ride to Thornfield took 3 hours. Margaret sat across from him, with her hands folded in her lap and her spine held away from the seatback, as though comfort were a debt she could not afford to owe. Edward watched the countryside pass and tried not to look at her. He failed. She was thin, not fashionably slender, but genuinely underfed, the kind of thin that spoke of winters measured in meals missed and summers counted in labor performed. Her hair was dark, pinned haphazardly with what appeared to be a bent kitchen fork. Her hands were calloused, the nails cut blunt. And yet there was something in the way she held herself that defied every visible evidence of deprivation. She sat like a woman who had once owned something precious, and, though it had been taken from her, still remembered what it felt like to possess it. "You are not a servant," Edward said, more to himself than to her.
"I have been a servant for 8 years.
"That is not the same thing." She looked at him then, really looked, with an attention so focused it felt almost clinical. "You bought me from a man who traded his daughter for a horse. I am whatever you decide I am." "I am deciding nothing. I am asking." Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but a rearrangement of defenses. "I was educated. My mother saw to it before she died. I can read Latin, manage accounts, and identify most of the poisonous plants in an English garden." The poisonous plants. My mother was practical. The ghost of a smile crossed Edward's mouth before he could stop it. He turned back to the window. The rain had started, not the gentle spring rain of the pastoral poets, but the heavy, deliberate downpour that seemed designed to make the world look as though it had been crying. Thornfield Hall announced itself through the mist like a confession. Massive, grey, severe. Its windows dark, save for a single light in the east wing that flickered with the unsteady rhythm of a candle, attended by someone who had been waiting too long. The house was beautiful in the way that abandoned churches are beautiful. Structurally sound, aesthetically impressive, and hollowed out by the absence of whatever had once made it sacred. Mrs. Fairchild, the housekeeper, met them at the door. She was a broad woman, with hands that looked capable of either bread-making or murder, depending on the provocation, and eyes that missed nothing. "Your Grace, you've brought a guest." "I've brought Margaret. She will need a room, a meal, and clothing that was not designed to humiliate her." Mrs. Fairchild's gaze moved from the Duke to the girl and back again. Whatever assessment she conducted took approximately 2 seconds. "The blue room." The blue room. Margaret was led upstairs without ceremony. Edward stood in the entrance hall and listened to her footsteps recede. Careful, measured. Each one placed with the deliberation of someone walking across ice that might not hold. When the sound faded, he pressed his back against the nearest wall and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 hours. He had not saved Catherine. He had stood on the lawn of Briarwood Hall and watched the woman he had loved since childhood burn alive inside a building he could have entered if he had been braver, faster, less paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what was happening. The fire had been set deliberately. Arson, the magistrate later determined, by a debtor of Catherine's father, who had chosen violence over patience. By the time Edward understood, the east wall had already collapsed. By the time he moved, there was nothing left to move toward. 6 years. 6 years of a house too large for one person. 6 years of declining every invitation, every matchmaker's suggestion, every well-meaning friend's attempt to pull him back into the living world. He had built his grief into the walls of Thornfield, the way builders set stones into mortar, each piece load-bearing, each piece essential to the structure. Remove one, and the whole thing might come down. And now this girl, this Margaret, who held her body the way Catherine had held hers, who met his gaze with the same unflinching assessment, who carried herself like someone who had been broken and reassembled without instructions, and had made something functional from the pieces. He was not saving her. He was haunting himself. The morning light at Thornfield arrived through windows that needed cleaning. Margaret discovered this when she woke in the blue room. Actually woke in a bed, an event so foreign to her recent experience that she spent a full minute cataloguing the sensation before she trusted it. Clean sheets. A pillow with actual feathers inside it, not straw. A blanket that covered her entirely. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt something she had not felt in 8 years. Safety, or its approximation. She dressed in the clothes Mrs. Fairchild had laid out, a simple grey dress that fit better than anything she had worn since childhood. The fabric was good, the seams straight. Someone had cared about these details. Margaret ran her fingers along the hem and noted that the stitching was done by hand, not machine. Mrs. Fairchild, she suspected, had made this herself. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm with the smell of bread and something savoury that Margaret could not identify from the hallway. She found Mrs. Fairchild at the stove, moving with the efficient grace of a woman who had been cooking for this household long enough to do it while simultaneously conducting 3 other tasks. "Sit." Mrs. Fairchild placed a plate in front of her without waiting for a response. Eggs, toast, preserves, tea. More food than Margaret had seen on a single plate in months. "Does the Duke usually bring women home from markets?" Mrs. Fairchild's wooden spoon paused mid-stir. "The Duke does not usually bring anyone home from anywhere. The Duke does not usually leave this house. The Duke, until yesterday, had spent the better part of 6 years constructing a life designed to touch no one and be touched by no one." She resumed stirring. "So no, This is not usual. Margaret ate. The food was extraordinary. Not because of any particular culinary achievement, but because hunger has a way of turning the ordinary into the miraculous. She ate every bite, and then sat looking at the empty plate, the way one looks at evidence of something incredible. Why did he buy me? That, Mrs. Fairchild said, turning to face her fully, is something you will have to ask him, and I suspect the answer he gives you will not be the real one. The library was the warmest room in Thornfield Hall, and Margaret found it by accident, or, rather, by the kind of instinct that draws certain people toward books the way a compass needle is drawn toward north. It was a vast room, 2 stories high, with shelves that climbed toward a ceiling painted with clouds that had been accumulating dust since before she was born. The fire was burning. The Duke was in a chair by the hearth, reading, and he did not look up when she entered. She stood in the doorway for 11 seconds. She counted. "You may come in," he said, still not looking up. "The books are not locked." She entered. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet, a habit born of years in a household where making noise invited attention, and attention invited punishment. She moved along the shelves, her fingers trailing spines, reading titles with the quiet hunger of someone who had been starving for this specific nourishment. "You have Wollstonecraft," she said. Now he looked up. "You know Wollstonecraft?" "My mother gave me a vindication when I was 12. She said it would either make me furious or make me brave." Margaret pulled the volume from the shelf and held it. "It did both." Edward closed his own book. He studied her, not with the acquisitive assessment of the market, but with something more careful, more uncertain. "Your mother sounds as though she was a remarkable woman." "She was a woman who understood that the world would not make space for her daughter. So she built the space herself, in secret, out of books and questions, and the stubborn refusal to accept that ignorance was the same as virtue." Margaret replaced the book carefully. "She died when I was 14. My father sold everything she owned within a month. The books went first." "And then?" "And then I became useful. I cleaned, I cooked. I managed his accounts because he could not add a column of figures without losing his place. And when he ran out of things to sell, he sold me." The fire crackled in the silence between them. Edward's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, a small movement, barely visible, but Margaret noticed it. She noticed most things. It was a survival skill that had become, over time, something more like a diagnostic instrument. "You are angry," she said. "I am furious." "At my father?" "At everyone who watched and said nothing." She tilted her head, studying him with that clinical precision again. "Including yourself?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Edward's jaw tightened. He stood, moved to the window, pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. Outside, the rain had not stopped. The gardens of Thornfield stretched away into grey obscurity, their borders invisible, their shapes reduced to suggestions. "I did not know," he said quietly. "No, but you have the look of a man who has failed to act before. Not yesterday. Before." He turned. His face had changed. Not anger, exactly, but something rawer, something stripped. "What makes you say that?" "Because you bought me the way a man repays a debt. Not with joy, with obligation." The sentence hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was yet willing to cross. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, turned back to the window. Margaret waited. She was good at waiting. 8 years of service had taught her that patience was the one luxury no one could confiscate. "There was a woman," he said at last. "Before. A woman I should have saved and didn't. She died because I hesitated. And I remind you of her." He said nothing, which was answer enough. Margaret crossed her arms. When she spoke, her voice carried something new. Not anger, not pity, but the quiet authority of a woman who had just identified the structural flaw in a building she was being asked to inhabit. "That is not kindness. That is not rescue. that is atonement dressed up as generosity. She held his gaze. "I will not be your penance, Your Grace. I have spent 8 years being someone else's transaction. I will not spend another day being someone else's ghost." She left the library. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet, but the door clicked shut behind her with the definitiveness of a verdict. Edward stood alone by the window. The rain ran down the glass in channels that merged and separated and merged again, like people who cannot decide whether they are better together or apart. His reflection stared back at him. A man who had thought he was doing something noble and had just been told, with surgical precision, that he was doing something selfish. She was right. That was the worst of it. She was entirely, devastatingly right. 3 days passed. Margaret and the Duke occupied the same house, the way planets occupy the same solar system, aware of each other's gravitational pull, maintaining careful orbits, never quite colliding. She spent her mornings in the kitchen with Mrs. Fairchild, learning the rhythms of the household. She spent her afternoons in the library, reading with the systematic veracity of someone making up for lost years. She spent her evenings in the blue room, sitting by the window, watching the last light drain from the Thornfield Gardens. Edward watched her the way one watches weather, from a distance, with an awareness that what one was observing had nothing to do with one's own preferences or plans. On the 4th day, the ledgers arrived. His steward, Mr. Grady, had been managing Thornfield's accounts for 12 years. He brought the quarterly books to the library every 3 months, presented them with the confidence of a man who knew his employer would not examine them closely, and departed with a self-satisfied air that made the servants uneasy. Margaret was reading in the corner when Grady entered. She did not look up. Grady did not notice her. This was a mistake. Edward flipped through the pages with his usual distracted attention. Numbers, columns, summaries. Grady narrated each section with practiced fluency. "The roof repairs came in slightly overestimate, Your Grace. The grain yields were below average due to the late frost. The tenant rents are current, with the exception of the Holloways, who are 3 months behind." "Fine," Edward said. "It is not fine." Both men turned. Margaret had risen from her chair. She was holding a book in one hand, and her other hand was pressed flat against the library table, fingers spread, as though she were reading the numbers through the wood. "I beg your pardon?" Grady's voice carried the particular offense of a man who has been interrupted by someone he considers beneath his notice. "The Holloway rent. You listed it as 3 months overdue at £18, but the Holloway tenancy was renegotiated 2 years ago at £12 per quarter. I read the original contract in the estate files yesterday. Either the rent was raised without the Duke's knowledge, or someone is collecting 18 and recording 12. She paused. "Neither explanation reflects well on you." Grady's face underwent a transformation that Margaret watched with professional interest. Surprise, calculation, the brief flicker of a man deciding which lie to deploy, and then the particular pallor that accompanies the realization that the lie will not be sufficient. The records may contain a transcription error. Page 47 also contains a transcription error. And page 62. And the entire section on timber revenues, which lists sales to a company called Ashfield & Sons, a company that does not exist. I checked. The silence in the library was absolute. Edward looked at the ledger. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Grady, whose complexion had achieved the color of fresh milk. "You checked," Edward said, and his voice contained something Margaret had not heard from him before. Not anger, not surprise, but the hard-edged awakening of a man who has just realized how long he has been asleep. "I am good with numbers," Margaret said. "My mother was practical." Grady was dismissed that afternoon. He left Thornfield with his belongings in a single trunk, and his reputation in considerably worse condition. The household staff, who had collectively despised him for a decade, watched his departure from the kitchen windows with expressions of barely concealed satisfaction. Mrs. Fairchild found Margaret in the garden afterward, sitting on a stone bench that was still damp from the morning rain. She was not celebrating. She was staring at her hands. "He will be angry with me," Margaret said. "The Duke?" "Grady had been here 12 years. I have been here 4 days. Men do not thank women who expose the failures they should have caught themselves." Mrs. Fairchild sat beside her. The bench was cold. Neither of them mentioned it. "You do not know this man yet." "I know men." "You know your father. That is not the same species." A sound came from the garden door. Edward stood there, still holding the ledger, his coat abandoned somewhere between the library and here. His hair was disordered in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it, a gesture Margaret had already catalogued as his response to emotional distress. "You saved me £600, he said. "Approximately. And you did it in 4 days, with access to files I have ignored for years." "You were not ignoring them. You were trusting someone who did not deserve your trust. Those are different things." He came closer, stopped at the end of the bench. The distance between them was 3 feet. Close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be respectful. "I owe you an apology." "For Grady?" "For why I brought you here. You were right, in the library, the first day. You were right about everything." Margaret looked up at him. The afternoon light caught the sharp planes of his face and softened them into something that looked, for the first time since she had met him, almost vulnerable. "I know," she said, "but knowing you bought me because I look like a dead woman is not the same as knowing what you intend to do about it." "I intend to do nothing about it. Nothing. I intend to let you be exactly who you are, not who she was, not who I need you to be. Not a replacement, not a redemption, not a project. Just Margaret." He said her name carefully, as though testing its weight. Just Margaret, who is good with numbers and knows which plants are poisonous and reads Wollstonecraft and tells me truths I have been avoiding for 6 years. She studied him for a long time. The garden was quiet around them, just the drip of water from the eaves and the distant bleating of sheep on the lower fields, and the faint, persistent song of a bird that had not received the message about the rain. "That is a beginning," she said. "It is not a promise." "I know." "Good." She stood. "Your timber accounts are also wrong, by the way. I'll have a corrected summary by tomorrow." She walked back toward the house. Edward stayed in the garden, sitting on the bench she had vacated, pressing his palms flat against the cold stone. The impression of her warmth was already fading. He found himself wanting to preserve it. The weeks that followed did not unfold smoothly. They unfolded the way real things unfold, unevenly, with setbacks and silences and small, unexpected moments of grace. Margaret took over the estate accounts with an efficiency that bordered on surgical. She found 3 more discrepancies in Grady's records, recovered £200 in misallocated tenant payments, and negotiated a new timber contract with a local merchant that increased Thornfield's revenues by 15%. She did all of this from the library, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, with her hair slowly escaping its pins as the hours passed and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. Edward found himself inventing reasons to visit the library. He would enter with a question about crop rotation or fence repairs, questions he knew the answers to, questions that did not require consultation. Margaret would look up from her work, assess the legitimacy of his question in approximately 2 seconds, and answer it with a precision that left no room for follow-up. He would stand there, holding the unnecessary question like an empty vessel, and wonder when he had become a man who fabricated excuses to be in the same room as someone. "You could simply sit," she said one afternoon, not looking up from a column of figures. "You do not need a reason to be in your own library." "I have a reason." "The question about hay storage was answered 3 days ago. You asked it again." "Perhaps I forgot the answer." "You have an exceptional memory. You quoted Virgil to me in the original Latin yesterday. You did not forget the answer about hay storage." He sat. The silence between them was different now. No longer the heavy, avoidant silence of the first days, but something warmer, something that had been worn smooth by proximity. Margaret worked. Edward read. The fire burned between them like a shared heartbeat. "Tell me about her," Margaret said one evening. Edward's hand stilled on his book. "About whom?" "Do not do that. We both know about whom." He set the book down. He looked at the fire. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of someone opening a door they have kept locked for a very long time.
Her name was Catherine Blackwell. We grew up on neighboring estates. She was the first person I ever met who made me feel that the world was not a problem to be managed, but a place to be inhabited. She laughed at things that deserved to be laughed at. She read everything she could find. She had a temper that could strip paint from walls, and she was the bravest person I have ever known. How did she die? A fire, set deliberately at her family's home, by a man her father owed money to. I was there. I saw it start. I could have gone in. I could have... His voice broke, a clean fracture like a bone snapping. He pressed his hand over his eyes. I stood on the lawn and watched. By the time I moved, the roof had collapsed. Margaret was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. You could not have survived that fire. You do not know that. I know that a collapsed roof kills everyone beneath it. I know that a fire hot enough to bring down a structure is a fire that consumes everything it touches. I know that you are not the man who set it. She paused. And I know that you have spent 6 years punishing yourself for a death that was not your failure. It was my hesitation. Hesitation in the face of certain death is not cowardice. It is biology. He lowered his hand. His eyes were dry. The grief had been refined past tears, condensed into something harder and more durable. You sound very certain. I am certain. Because I watched my father sell me to a stranger, and I did not fight him. I did not scream. I did not run. I stood there and allowed it to happen because in that moment, my body understood something my mind refused to accept. That fighting would not change the outcome. It would only add bruises to the transaction. She met his gaze. We do not choose our paralysis. We choose what we do after it. The sentence settled between them like an anchor dropping into deep water. Edward looked at Margaret, not at the ghost of Catherine, not at the instrument of his own atonement, but at the woman sitting across from him, who had just offered him something no one else had been able to give in 6 years. Permission to stop. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me. Agree with me. They are different things. I agree with you. Good. Now, your fence contractor is overcharging you by 12%. Shall I address it, or would you prefer to continue paying for his incompetence as a form of character building? A sound escaped him. Rough, surprised, unfamiliar. It took him a moment to identify it. He was laughing. Mrs. Fairchild heard it from the kitchen. She set down her knife, pressed her hand to her chest, and whispered something that might have been a prayer or might have been a profanity. After 6 years, the difference felt academic. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of letter that changes the temperature of every room it enters. It was addressed to the Duke of Thornfield, in handwriting so precise it looked mechanical, and it bore the seal of Ashby Park. Lord Ashby wanted his daughter back. Not, the letter clarified, out of paternal feeling, out of business. He had arranged a marriage for Margaret, a wealthy widower named Cornelius Pratt, who needed a wife to manage his household and his 4 children, and who was willing to pay handsomely for the privilege of acquiring one without the inconvenience of courtship. Pratt had offered £200. Lord Ashby wanted Margaret returned so he could complete the transaction. Edward read the letter twice. The second reading was slower than the first, the way one rereads a sentence that contains a word one cannot believe exists. Then he folded it carefully, placed it on his desk, and went to find Margaret.
She was in the garden. She had claimed a section of the east border as her own and had been planting things, herbs mostly, but also flowers that Edward did not recognize. She knelt in the earth with soil on her hands and her hair coming loose, and an expression of concentrated peace that he had never seen on her face before. "Your father has written," he said. She did not look up. Her hands continued working the soil around a basil plant. "What does he want?" "He wants you back. He has found a buyer." Now she looked up. Her face did not collapse. It compressed, the way a fist tightens before a blow. A buyer. A Mr. Cornelius Pratt, widower, 4 children, £200. Margaret sat back on her heels. She looked at the dirt on her hands, the plants she had been tending, the garden she had been building in a place she did not own. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no joy in it. "I have increased in value. He sold me for £4. Now I am worth 200. I wonder what made the difference." "Margaret, is it because I can read? Because I uncovered a thief? Because I planted basil in a duke's garden?" She stood, brushing soil from her skirt with methodical precision. "Or is it simply that supply and demand have shifted, and daughters who do not fight back are harder to find than they used to be? I have no intention of returning you. You cannot keep me either. You have no legal claim. The transaction at the market was not a contract. It was a humiliation I survived. If my father demands my return, the law is on his side. The law is wrong. The law is always wrong about women. That has not historically prevented it from being enforced." They stood in the garden, 3 feet apart, the same distance as the bench, but charged now with something different. The wind moved through the herb bed and carried the scent of basil and rosemary, green and sharp and alive. "I will fight him," Edward said. "Why?" "Because you belong to no one. Not to him, not to Pratt, not to me." That is the correct answer. She studied him with that diagnostic attention. But it is not the complete one. "No." "Then tell me the complete one." He was quiet for a long time. The garden waited around them, patient, growing, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded within its borders. "Because in 4 weeks, you have done something to this house that I could not do in 6 years. You have made it alive again. Not by being Catherine, not by being a replacement for anyone. By being Margaret, who is furious and precise and reads Wollstonecraft and plants basil in places that have not grown anything in years. And because He stopped, started again. "Because I would rather burn this estate to the ground than hand you to a man who would buy you like livestock." Margaret's eyes changed. The clinical assessment softened into something warmer, something that had been held in reserve, something she had not allowed herself to feel. Because feeling had been, for 8 years, a luxury that came with a price she could not afford. "That is the complete answer," she said quietly. "Is it enough?" "It is a beginning." Lord Ashby arrived at Thornfield on a Thursday, accompanied by Mr. Cornelius Pratt and a solicitor whose name no one bothered to learn. They arrived in a carriage that was too fine for Ashby's means, borrowed, Margaret suspected, from Pratt, who had the look of a man accustomed to purchasing whatever he desired and resenting anyone who suggested he could not. Pratt was 53, thick-necked, with small eyes set deep in a face that suggested generations of comfortable cruelty. He examined Margaret the way one examines livestock: teeth, posture, the width of her hips. She stood in the entrance hall of Thornfield and allowed the examination with the stillness of a woman who was not enduring the moment, but cataloguing it. "She'll do," Pratt said. "A bit thin, but she's young. She'll fill out." "She is standing in front of you," Margaret said, "and she can hear you." Pratt blinked. It was the blink of a man who has encountered a phenomenon outside his frame of reference. A dog that speaks, a chair that moves, a woman who answers back. He turned to Lord Ashby. "You said she was docile." She was. Ashby shot Margaret a look that she recognized from childhood, the warning that preceded punishment. She has been corrupted by proximity to wealth. A few weeks in your household will correct it. Nothing will be corrected, Edward said from the doorway, because nothing will be transferred. He entered the hall the way weather enters a room, changing the pressure, the temperature, the quality of the air. He was dressed in black, which Margaret suspected was deliberate. He looked exactly like what he was. A duke who had decided that something under his roof was worth defending, and who possessed the resources and the fury to defend it. Lord Ashby, Mr. Pratt. He did not offer his hand. You are in my house. You will not speak about a person under my protection as though she were inventory. She is my daughter, Ashby said. I have legal custody. You sold your legal custody for £4 and a horse with a cracked hoof. If you would like, I can produce witnesses. The farrier, the blacksmith's wife, the vicar. Edward's voice was conversational, but beneath the conversation was bedrock. I also have a solicitor. His name is Wentworth, and he has spent the last week preparing a petition to the Court of Chancery, arguing that your habitual sale of a dependent constitutes abandonment of parental authority. He is quite confident. The solicitor, whose name no one bothered to learn, shuffled his papers nervously. Pratt stepped forward. Now see here, Thornfield. I have a contract. You have a piece of paper signed by a man who had no authority to sign it. A contract for the sale of a human being is not enforceable in English law. It is, in fact, evidence. Edward paused. Would you like me to submit it as such? The room was very quiet. Margaret stood between the two parties, her past on one side, her present on the other, and felt the particular vertigo of watching your own life become a negotiation between men. She had felt this before, at the market, at Ashby Park, in every room where her father had conducted business with her body as the commodity. But this time was different, because this time, she was not the object of the negotiation. She was the reason for it. I would like to speak, she said. Every head turned. Margaret stepped forward, not toward Edward, not toward her father, but into the center of the room, the point equidistant from all parties. Mr. Pratt, you want a wife who will manage your household and raise your children. I understand the appeal of acquiring such a person through purchase rather than persuasion. It eliminates the inconvenient possibility that she might have preferences. But I should tell you, I have preferences. I prefer to be asked rather than acquired. I prefer to choose my own life rather than have it chosen for me. And I prefer to remain in a place where my value is measured by what I contribute, not by what I cost. She turned to her father. Father, you sold me once for £4. You are attempting to sell me again for 200. I wonder, is the increase a reflection of my worth or of your debts? She paused. Do not answer. I know which it is. And then she turned to Edward. And you, if you fight this battle for me, you must understand something. I am not Catherine. I will never be Catherine. If you defend me, it must be because I am Margaret. Difficult, precise, inconvenient, alive. Not because defending me allows you to rewrite a night 6 years ago when you stood on a lawn and could not move. The hall was silent. 3 men looked at a woman who had just dismantled each of their positions with the efficiency of a surgeon and the calm of a philosopher. Edward spoke first. I know exactly who you are, and you are right. I cannot rewrite what happened to Catherine. But I can choose what I do now. I choose to fight for you, not as atonement, as recognition. Recognition of what? That you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and that this house, which I turned into a tomb, has become a home since you arrived. Not because you replaced anyone, because you refused to. Margaret looked at him for a long time. The entrance hall of Thornfield was cold, draughty, its stones carrying the chill of centuries.
but something in it was warming. Not the air, but the space between two people who had been, until very recently, alone.
She turned back to her father.
Leave. Margaret, leave. And do not write. Do not send emissaries. Do not sell my name to anyone else. I am done being your currency. Her voice did not waver. Her hands were steady at her sides. She was, in that moment, everything her mother had built her to be. Educated, precise, unbending, and free. Lord Ashby looked at Pratt. Pratt looked at the solicitor. The solicitor looked at his shoes. The three of them left Thornfield without another word, their carriage crunching over the gravel drive, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around the bend, like a sentence being erased. Mrs. Fairchild appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was holding a bread knife and wearing the expression of a woman who had been prepared, if necessary, to use it. "Is it over?" "It is over," Margaret said. "Good." Mrs. Fairchild returned to the kitchen. Moments later, the sounds of aggressive bread cutting filled the hall, each slice carrying the force of every opinion Mrs. Fairchild had been too professional to voice for the last hour. Margaret turned to Edward. They stood in the entrance hall, 3 feet apart, in the place where everything had changed. "Thank you," she said. "You told me not to thank you. You told me to agree. I am extending you the same courtesy." "Fine. What should I agree with?" "That you will stay. Not because I ask, but because you choose." "I choose," she said. And then, more quietly, "I have been choosing this for weeks. I simply was not willing to say it until I was certain you were not choosing a ghost." He reached out. His hand stopped halfway, hovering in the air between them, uncertain, a question in physical form. Margaret looked at it. She thought about every hand that had gripped her, pulled her, directed her, controlled her. She thought about the difference between a hand that takes and a hand that offers. She placed her fingers in his. His hand closed around hers, gently, carefully, with the deliberate attention of a man handling something he understood to be both strong and precious. The warmth of his palm moved through her skin like a message in a language she had almost forgotten. "Your hands are cold," he said. "They are always cold. My mother said it was because I keep all my warmth on the inside." Your mother was right about everything. Almost everything. She thought parsley was worth growing. It is not. He laughed again. The sound was warmer this time, fuller, and Margaret felt it in her chest the way one feels music, not as information, but as resonance. The spring unfolded around Thornfield like a story being told for the first time. Margaret's garden grew. The basil, the rosemary, the thyme, the lavender she had planted along the south wall that filled the air with a scent so beautiful it made the bees drunk with gratitude. She reorganized the estate accounts so thoroughly that the new steward, a young man named Fletcher who had the good sense to be terrified of her, ran his numbers with an accuracy that bordered on paranoid. Edward began leaving the house. This was, according to Mrs. Fairchild, approximately as remarkable as the sun changing direction. He rode the lower fields. He visited tenants. He attended a church service and managed not to look as though he was being tortured. He did all of this because Margaret had told him, one afternoon in the library, that a man who builds his entire life around avoiding pain will eventually become the thing he is trying to avoid. A cold room, a locked door, a house where no one lives. "That is not kindness," he had said. "That is a diagnosis." "I'm a moral force," she had replied. "We diagnose. It is what we do." He had looked at her then the way one looks at a fire, with the understanding that the thing warming you is also the thing capable of consuming you, and with the willingness to stay close anyway. They walked the grounds together in the evenings, long, slow circuits of the garden, the orchard, the path along the stream where willows trailed their fingers in the water. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her mother's library, 14 books that had contained, in Margaret's estimation, more wisdom than the entire collection at Thornfield.
He told her about the year after Catherine's death, when he had not spoken for 3 months, and Mrs. Fairchild had communicated with him entirely through the emotional content of his meals. Bland food for numb days, spicy food for angry ones, pudding when she decided he needed to remember that pleasure existed. "She fed you back to life," Margaret said. "She is relentless." "She is magnificent." Those are the same thing. One evening, they stopped by the stream. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the water gold and the willows bronze, and Margaret's face in a light that made Edward forget every other light he had ever seen. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You love me." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "I have known for some time." "How long?" "Since the hay storage question. The second time." "That was 3 weeks ago." "Yes." "You have known for 3 weeks and said nothing." "I was waiting." She turned to face him. The stream moved behind her, gold and bronze and endless. "I was waiting to see if you loved me. Not the memory you found in my face. Not the redemption you built from my presence. Me. The woman who reads your accounts and corrects your gardener and tells you truths you do not want to hear." "I love you," he said. The words came out rough, unpolished, nothing like the declarations he had imagined in his weaker moments. "I love you, Margaret. Not because you remind me of anyone, because you are the most infuriating, brilliant, terrifying person I have ever encountered. And I would rather spend the rest of my life being diagnosed by you than spend another day in the version of this house that existed before you arrived." She looked at him. Her Riverstone eyes were bright, with something she had not permitted herself to feel in 8 years. Not since the day her mother died, and she had learned that love was a thing that could be confiscated, like books, like dignity, like a name. "I love you too," she said. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "I keep the accounts. I keep the garden. I keep my name. Margaret, not the Duchess, not Lady Thornfield, not any title that replaces who I am with what I married. And if you ever make a decision about my life without consulting me, I will plant hemlock in your tea garden and let you wonder." The poisonous plants. My mother was practical. He kissed her. Not the careful, tentative kiss of a man testing permission, but the honest, desperate kiss of a man who had been standing outside a fire for 6 years and had finally found the courage to walk in. Not to burn, but to warm. She kissed him back with equal honesty, equal force, her hands gripping the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer the way one pulls a door shut against a storm. When they parted, the sun had finished setting. The stream ran dark. The willows whispered to each other about what they had witnessed. "Your hands are warm," Margaret said. "Your influence. Do not blame me for your circulation." He laughed. She laughed. The sound moved across the water and into the evening, and became part of the landscape, part of Thornfield, part of the story the house would tell from now on. They married in the garden 3 weeks later. The ceremony was brief, 12 minutes, conducted by the vicar who had once stood in the market and watched Margaret's father sell her, and who had spent every Sunday since carrying the weight of his own cowardice like a stone in his pocket. He performed the ceremony with an earnestness that approached desperation, as though he could retroactively redeem his silence by blessing this union with everything he had. Margaret wore a dress that Mrs. Fairchild had made by hand, white linen, simple, with sprigs of rosemary stitched into the hem. "For remembrance," Mrs. Fairchild said when she presented it, and both women understood that the remembrance was not for the past, but for this moment. The moment when a woman who had been sold like property chose, freely and irrevocably, to give herself. Edward wore the ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a gold band set with a single emerald, engraved with vines and roses. He placed it on Margaret's finger with hands that trembled, and she steadied them with her own. "You are shaking,"
she said. "I am terrified." "Of what?" "Of deserving this." "You do not deserve it. You earn it. Every day. Starting now." 6 months later, on a morning in October, Margaret woke to find the first frost on the garden. She wrapped herself in a shawl, the good wool one that Mrs. Fairchild had knitted, the one with the pattern that looked like waves, and walked the path between the herb beds. The basil had gone. The rosemary endured. The lavender slept beneath its frost coat, waiting for spring. Edward found her there, standing at the edge of the garden, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The frost. It will kill the basil I planted in March." "And?" "And I will plant more in spring. That is what one does." He stood beside her. The distance between them was 0. His arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest, their bodies sharing warmth in the way that bodies do when they have learned that closeness is not a risk, but a resource. The carved horse, the one Edward had bought at Hartfield Market, along with the sway-backed gelding and Margaret herself, sat on the mantel in the library. Margaret had found it in a drawer one afternoon and placed it there without explanation. When Edward asked, she said only, "It should be seen. Everything about that day should be seen. Not because it was good, but because it led here." The horse was walnut, crudely carved, its legs too short and its head too large. It was, by any objective standard, worthless, but it stood on the mantel of a duke's library like a monument, and anyone who asked about it received a story that began with a market and a transaction, and ended with a woman who refused to be anyone's atonement, and a man who learned, finally, that the opposite of hesitation is not action, but love. Thornfield Hall was warm that winter. The fires burned in every room. The windows had been cleaned, the books were read, the accounts were immaculate. The garden slept beneath its frost, dreaming of spring, dreaming of basil, dreaming of the woman who had planted it. Not because she owned the land, but because she had decided it was worth tending. And that, in the end, was what changed everything. Not a rescue, not a redemption, not a man buying a woman from her father at a country market, but a woman who looked at a cold, empty house and saw something worth saving, and a man who looked at a woman and saw, for the first time in 6 years, not the ghost of what he had lost, but the living, breathing, furious reality of what he had found. If this story stayed with you, if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, or to carry someone else's failure as though it were your own, then you are not alone. Margaret's journey from Hartfield Market to the garden at Thornfield is a reminder that our worth is never determined by the price someone else puts on us. It is determined by what we choose to build when we are finally free to choose. Tell me in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest? Was it Margaret confronting her father in the entrance hall, the Duke's confession by the stream, or that quiet morning in the frost-covered garden? I read every single comment, and I am always amazed by the stories you share. If this is your first time here, welcome to the fireside. We tell stories about people who refuse to be defined by their circumstances. Subscribe, settle in, and I will see you in the next one.